What's going on there, everybody? Brandon coming to you again with another video. So I've been doing a lot of holiday themed stuff here lately. I've been painting some Christmas trees and some snowmen and all kinds of that jazz. So I decided to back up a little bit and do some harvest stuff. So we're going to have a look at some pumpkins here sitting next to an old red barn on some hay. This is my first attempt at painting anything like this. First attempt at pumpkins, first attempt at an old red barnwood looking scene. So if you want to follow along in my process of this one, we're going to give that a look now at this video. Let's check it out. Alright, so what we have here is an 8x10 canvas that we're going to get started on here with this kind of harvest day pumpkin laying next to a barn project. I'm just going to start basically here with a 1-inch brush, and we're going to put in some background color of what will be the wall of the barn itself, and then also the hay bale and some hay along the bottom here. And then we'll probably put a smaller pumpkin sitting on top of the hay bale and a larger one sitting on the ground next to it. So to do that, we're going to go with, I'm going to go with some raw umber, maybe a touch of black, just basically to create a background for our hay bale and our hay along the ground. So what we're looking for is a dark, we're looking for a dark value of some brown here, and I'm going to come in with a thin glaze of this, basically to tone my canvas, like you may have seen me done in a previous project. I'm going to tone my canvas here with essentially the colors that I think I'm going to be putting in these areas, and then I'll let that glaze dry and come back in with the official layers of paint that I want. So this is basically toning my canvas and getting rid of the initial color that's on there without just toning the whole canvas with a random background color. This is allowing me to put in essentially the colors that I think I'm going to be using and the colors that I'm going to be putting them. Now for this barn wall that I'm going to have here, it's going to be mostly a gray kind of background that I'm going to come back in with some red to make it a red barn. So my initial glaze here that I'm going to put on to tone the canvas, I'm going to go with a thin gray color, basically just some black, some titanium white, maybe still a little bit of that raw umber that I had in, and I'm going to make my brush strokes here vertical as opposed to horizontal, since that's the direction that these barn boards are going to be sitting in. It'll just give me any individual brush strokes that are visible when this is all said and done will be in the proper direction of the way the boards are laying, so that's fine. And again, this is just a toning of the canvas at this point, putting the major colors in the areas that they're going to be, so I can basically step back and give this a look to see if there's any changes that I want to make. Alright, so that'll pretty much do for the barn wall and the ground. Now the pumpkin itself, let's just block it in with a little bit of raw umber and some yellow ochre, just to get an idea of where we want to put it. The larger one, let's say we're going to put it right in here. And the smaller one that we're going to put on top of our hay bale, we'll stick it maybe something like that. Okay. Now I can basically sit here and give a look at this composition layout and make any changes that I think I want to make. So I'll probably make this pumpkin here maybe a little bit larger when it's all said and done than that. And I'm going to let this glazing dry here for a few minutes, and then I'm going to come back in and put in some thicker layers of those colors once I've decided that I'm happy with the way this layout is going. Okay, now that we've given this initial glazing color a chance to dry, I think I'm going to come back in now and put in the background color of the barn wall itself. So again, what I'm going to go for here is a barn wall that's essentially going to be a red painted wall that's going to have some weathering to it. So I'm going to end up painting red, or at least a tone of red anyway, on top of kind of a gray initial colored wood. So we want to put the gray color in first. I'm going to basically come into some titanium white with a little bit of raw umber and some black to create a gray wood color that will be painted over with red. And I'm switching to a 3/4 inch brush now at this point. And we're just going to use vertical brush strokes to come in here, because obviously the wood that would be sitting on this barn, that's the direction of what the wood would be laying. So we will create some wood grain. We'll create some wood grain texturing and effect just by putting our brush strokes in that direction. And we also don't have to worry about having some different values of the gray when it's all said and done, because the wood itself would also have different values. So we're going to come in with a couple of different values of this gray in some areas to create what looks like different wood grains. And again, as long as we keep our brush strokes vertical, we will achieve that effect that we're looking for in terms of barn wood that is sitting in the background. And as I mentioned before, I'm probably going to increase the size just a little bit of our larger pumpkin there, so we'll end up making him a little bit bigger than what he is currently. So all we're really looking for at this point is some different values of gray going on in the background that will ultimately be painted over with some reds to give us a barn back there, and it'll be a weathered wood look. So we're not going to go with full coverage of the red once we start using it. So this color will be still visible in some places, which is why I'm going to do a variety of the gray in here. That way what does become visible will look like weathered wood in the background. So we definitely want some visible vertical brush strokes of varying colors. Now I'm going to switch to the color that's going to be behind all of our hay for the hay bale and the hay along the ground. And really we're just going for darker value here of some raw umber, maybe some yellow ochre touched in with it. It's going to be the shadows and the darker background tones that are going to be visible underneath our hay. So we're going to put a few places that are actually a good bit darker than others, because ultimately there will be some shadow in there in some places it's a little more visible. So I'm going to come in here with a couple of different passes of the raw umber and add a little bit of titanium white to it in a few places, so it's not as dark in some places as it is in others. And we'll kind of work it back and forth and fade the darker and lighter colors in with a couple different passes here, so we will ultimately end up with a good mix of lighter and darker background areas that will provide us some good contrast in some areas when we lay our straw and hay highlights over the top of them. That's what we're looking for anyway. Varying degrees of shadow is what it boils down to. Drop in a few places of darker black and raw umber mix there. Give us a mottled background look. Yeah, I think that's a good place to start with that. Now we're going to go into a good bit more yellow ochre. With this same 3/4 inch brush, and we're going to lay in just some random horizontal streaks. Mostly horizontal streaks anyway. That will help break up that background color even more. Something like that. Now I'll give myself a little better idea of my overall pumpkin shape here and size, so I'm going to keep the yellow ochre that I'm dealing with here and add just a hint of red to this. And I'm going to come in here and make this pumpkin a little bit larger than I originally had put it in there. And then again, this is just establishing a background color over top of our original toning of the canvas that we did. And the same thing for the little guy over here. We're just going to drop him in. Obviously pumpkins are mostly round, but they're not perfect circles, so you just kind of drop something in that's close to the shape you are looking for. We'll go with something like that. Now our background there should be pretty close to drying that we've done on our barn, so I'm going to come in here now with this same 3/4 inch brush. Back to the color that we were using there, which is just mostly a gray of some black and some raw umber and some titanium white. But I'm going to lighten it up this time with a lot more titanium white. And I'm going to loosely touch the canvas here and create some streaks of this lighter area color. Mostly towards the bottom of these boards and wood that's going to be back there. Again, I'm just creating some streaks. Something like that. Now we're going to get started with laying the red in. And I think I'll just use the same brush because we're not going to go for a full smooth coverage of this red either. It's going to be kind of streaky to a certain extent. We're going to use red, and we're going to use just a little bit of the raw umber to darken that red up. See what we get with this, and we can adjust this tone and color if we want. We'll come back in eventually and put some darker lines. It'll be separating some boards in here probably. But for now, we're going to look for a little bit more coverage of the red towards the top of this canvas. And then let it kind of fade out towards the bottom of the canvas, as if the boards back here color is starting to fade on as they get closer to the ground. Maybe the rain has kicked up some water there that's washed the bottom off a little bit. Who knows? But that's the idea that I'm going for anyway. I'm going to go with a little more coverage of the paint towards the top of the canvas and let it fade. Let it fade as it gets to the bottom. Now also we're going to go with a variety of darker and lighter shades of this red color. So in some places we're going to have a little bit more raw umber in it than others, because again we're looking to create boards back here, and they're going to be obviously very uneven in terms of the wood grain and the colorations that you see across them. So you don't want it to be too consistent. That doesn't look quite as natural and as realistic. Okay, to create some separation with my boards back there, I'm going to put some dark lines in there that are going to show those edges, and I'm going to just use a piece of cardboard here, and to keep my boards about the same width, I've put a little mark on here that I'm going to use just to separate them the same distance. And I'm going to use a liner brush and use my same red mix that I've been doing for those boards themselves, but I'm going to add a lot more raw umber to it. I'm going to use the edge of my piece of cardboard here to create a relatively straight line. Doesn't have to be perfect, obviously. something like that. And then come over with my mark and do the same. I'll just move over and do it again. All right. Now we've got some guidelines there to go by to divide our boards up. I can come back in here with this liner brush and create some sharper edges where I want them. I think that's pretty good. Now that we have some lines to go by, we can continue to work on our boards back there to make them look a little more like we want. Now you can add as much wood grain texturing or not to this as you want, so I'm going to keep my liner brush up and I'm going to come in here with a couple of different values of this red color that we've been dealing with. So red and some raw umber. And I'm going to create some areas that just look like some wood grain. And you can do this a number of ways. Obviously we've got some streaks already built in there that we did with our larger 3/4 inch brush. And so now I can come in with some contrasting values of this color and basically put in any little wood grain textures that I want. Now they can go in a variety of different directions and do a number of different things on each board, but this is going to be old weathered looking wood back here, so there's no real right or wrong to it. You just add in here some texturing lines and some contrasting lines and some highlights however you feel fit to do so. And ultimately you'll end up with something that looks like an older piece of wood. Right now I'm working with a slightly darker value of red than I had on the wall itself, and then we'll come back and change it maybe to a lighter value. And this is again just, you do it till something makes you happy in terms of your look and your finished product. So like there I used my finger to kind of rub some of that out. The lines was a little sharper than I wanted. So I just quickly dealt with that, not a big deal. And I'm just going to continue to work with this liner brush, creating some wood grain lines and textures just at random. Nothing real specific here. I kind of like that board on the end the way it is. I think I might leave it like that. On a different board over here, I'm just changing up the direction of my brush strokes here to create a little different grain texture. That's all I'm doing. And that board got stuck through the sawmill at a different time, so we got some different texture going on. Who knows? Again, I think as random as possible is your best bet. Maybe there's a little bit of a hint of a knot in the wood in this one here, so we'll create maybe a semicircular looking thing. Alright, now we'll add a few lighter highlights of wood grain in a few places just to switch it up. All I'm going to do really is take some titanium white into that same mix that we've been using for that red, and we'll come into some areas with a little bit of the lighter highlight color now and drop in some lighter highlights on where the light out here is catching the edges of these boards and some of this wood grain. And again, you can get as detailed on this as you want. I mean, I'm doing what makes me happy on this, so I'm going to continue to play around with it until I get a look that I'm happy with. And this is my first attempt at doing this. I've never painted barn wood before in any capacity, nor have I painted pumpkins before, so this is all trial and error as I'm going. But I am going to play around with it until I get a look that I'm happy with. So I'm just letting you know what I'm doing. If you want to mess around with these highlights and values as well, I encourage you to do so. I think the more variations of color and contrasts and stuff you put in one, it just makes it all look a little more interesting as a finished product. So I'm always a fan for adding in a few little extra details of things as I'm going. My boards are all going to look a little bit different, so I'm adding some different texture lines and directions to each one. It's just whatever you want to do. Give you an appearance of some wood back there. I'm going for the old worn out, splintered looking wood effect. It's just what I want to go with here personally. So I really like the way that turned out, so I think I might try some more of that on some of these other boards. All I really did was just touch in a lighter value there with this liner brush to create more wood grain. But I like the way that came out, so I'm going to do the same thing in a few other places. This particular board here in the middle, or just to the left of middle, it's kind of got its own thing going on here. It's a little bit darker than the rest in some areas, and I'm going to be adding now some highlight to it. I don't know if it just has randomly become a focal point in terms of the wood in the background, but it certainly seems to stand out amongst the other boards, so we're going to let it do that at this point. I'm okay with that, creating an interesting effect with that one particular piece of board. It seems to be unique in its own right, so we'll let it do its thing. Okay, I'm pretty happy with the boards in the background. So let's go to doing a little bit of work, just a little bit of work at this point on our hay in the foreground here. We're going to put the pumpkins in before we finish the hay, but we want to get the hay started so we have a good base to work with. Then once we get our pumpkins finished, we'll put some of the hay in front, hanging out over the pumpkins themselves. So I'm not going to get too carried away with it, but I do want to at least get something going in the right direction. So we're going to take some yellow ochre and a little bit of raw umber to darken that just a tad. And I'm going to come in here and create with that just a few random sharper lines that'll ultimately end up being background as well. But these are going to be some pieces of hay that might be a little more visible because they're closer to the surface, so we can see a little bit more of the color on them. But they're not all the way out in the light, so they're not as bright as what we're going to end up with ultimately. And down here on the bottom, we're going to definitely make some random directions of them because They're going to be laying in all sorts of ways down here. On the hay bale, I'll keep them a little bit more in the same direction to a certain extent anyway. This bale is going to be over here. And there'll be a few pieces extending out towards the end that maybe we can see. Now we need to basically lighten up our values there to turn to more of a highlight color. So we're going to add a little bit of titanium white in there. And I'm trying to keep this paint fairly thin here. And using this liner brush. And again, down here on the bottom, these can go in a variety of directions because it's going to be basically like we've got hay just laying on the ground in a variety of directions. So just make some random marks in there. Once we put our pumpkins in, we'll put a few final specific detailed pieces of hay that will be a little sharper edges, maybe a little more visible up in the foreground. Right now we're just trying to give ourselves a general idea that we are sitting on some hay. Now for that bale back there, I want to be fairly intentional about creating a top to it and then a front edge. So this top here, I'm going to keep my straw highlights really close together. And then here on the sides, for now we'll broaden them out a little bit. And again, we're going to have a lot more variation of the highlight of this hay bale and everything once we've finished our pumpkin. So for right now, again, I'm just getting something in here to give me an idea of where we're headed. All right. Now I think we're ready to work on the main feature itself, which is going to be our two pumpkins. I'm going to do a background color again for these two pumpkins of yellow ochre with a little bit of red dropped in on it. And let's see what this looks like. That might be a little too bright to start out with, so let's add just a touch of raw umber in there. That might be a little better. So I want to put the darker color down first and then come back with my highlights. So I'm trying to keep the tones down and the intensity down a little bit of the initial color pass here on the background. And we'll give him a little bit of maybe the stem areas over here on that side. Again, down here on the bottom we'll have some coverage of hay when it's all said and done. Now, a pumpkin obviously has these creases on it that usually are traveling from, I guess, the poles of the pumpkin itself, where the stem is, and on the bottom. So I'm going to take my brush strokes essentially in those same directions as I'm putting this initial color pass in there. We're going to say our stem is somewhere in that top right corner there. And again, this doesn't have to be anything exact or perfect at this point. We are working in layers as we always do, so we're going to come back in here and fine-tune this. This is just giving us our starting point and our direction. But you can see by just doing that, we have started to give our large pumpkin there at least a little bit of shape, a little bit of character. We know where he lives now anyway. We'll do the same thing with this smaller one here, and I have to make another decision about, again, where do we want. Maybe the stem on this one will be sitting down in a little area right there. I'll have to sharpen those edges up a little bit with a smaller brush, but that's okay for now. All right, now we are going to just play around with some of our colors here on these guys. So I'm going to come back with a little more yellow ochre here. When it's all said and done, the more variety of this color you put in there, the more interesting your pumpkin will be at the end. So you can play around with adding some yellow medium in there and maybe some red in there, and just create several different passes of varying colors of tones and highlights. So I'm going to make a pass here with some more red in it with some titanium white in it. And start to give myself an idea of where I want highlights to be. And some of these individual ridges and grooves. Basically now I've gone in with more yellow ochre. Okay, so you just have to keep playing around with your values and your colors and your contrasts until you get a pumpkin looking the way you want him to look. I think what I'm going to do is allow this thing to dry for a few minutes. And so I'm going to come over here and work on the smaller one and do essentially the same thing. I'm going to go into some yellow ochre, maybe a hint of red, a little bit of titanium white, and just start creating some different contrasting lines and values of the shape of this pumpkin. You're going to have some lines and some grooves in there that are going to be a little darker than others. In the end, so I mean right now we're just kind of getting ourselves some sort of direction for that. Now I'm going to need a smaller brush to deal with what we got going on around this guy, so I'm going to come in with a smaller angled brush and do the same thing, but on the back of the pumpkin there you would be seeing the same kind of contrasting lines. We're going to drop a stem in there. So while I'm waiting for the pumpkins to dry, I'm going to go ahead and put in the background of where the stems will be. So this is basically just going into some raw umber. We're going to give this pumpkin a stem somewhere over here off this top right corner. So let's drop in a little bit of a dark just basically a dark background color right here that we can work with. Something to that effect. And then we'll do the same thing on our little pumpkin over here. We'll bring his stem right out of this area that we created. Alright, now we just have to create a little bit of character and ridges on those things. So really, it's just a matter of putting in some highlights here and there, creating some ridges on the stem itself. Touching in some various highlight colors of tans and grays and whatever else you want to throw in there. I mean, it doesn't have to be anything specific. It just needs to give us the idea that, hey, we've got a stem of the pumpkin sitting there. So I might throw in a little bit of, let's put a little bit of red into some raw umber. In just a couple of places. Maybe put in a little bit of even some blue in there to create like a purple, like some random color in there. Just to liven it up a little bit. Now we'll go into just a touch of titanium white with that. Creating a little different gray color because we had some blue put in there. And just tap it in some places, creating some interesting little things on the stems. Alright, works for me. Alright, so now that these pumpkins are good and dry on these base coats, I'm going to start detailing them out a little bit, and all we're really going to do is brighten up our values of our oranges in there with some little bit of yellows in some areas, because pumpkins kind of have this splotchy coloration to them most of the time. And then we have to make sure we keep a couple of areas that are showing these lines that run down it that are a little bit darker in value. So all I'm really going to do is come into some medium yellow and a little bit of red to create a little bit more vibrant of an orange color. And we'll have a look to see what this gives us. Really trying to brighten up my orange now on this pass with this larger brush, and then I will switch to a smaller one to finish detailing this thing out in terms of the highlights and edges and where some of the reflections and glare comes in on it. But I'm going to try and make this my last pass with this larger brush before I come back with a smaller one to finish out the detailing. I'm really brightening up the values of the orange on this pass with this one. I do want to keep it darker along the base just to provide a little color gradient change to add to the effect that this is a three-dimensional object, obviously, so I'm not carrying that brightest color all the way down to the bottom, and I can always come back and fade some of that darker color back in along the bottom if need be, so it's not critical at this stage if you get it exactly perfect, obviously. The great thing about painting is you can always come back in and make some changes. So try to get it as close to our finished product as I can on this pass, but it's not going to be that big a deal if we have to come back and do some manipulating. So I think that's about all I'm going to do with the larger brush on this particular pumpkin. So let's move to the smaller one now. And again, I'm going to come back into some medium yellow with a little bit of red. Might not be able to do as much with the larger brush on this one just because the pumpkin itself is so much smaller. But we'll at least get it moving in the right direction. In fact, I'm going to say that that's probably all I'm going to be able to do with the larger brush on this one. So we're going to switch to a smaller brush now. And then finish working these guys out. So really what we're trying to achieve here is try to make these guys look as three-dimensional as possible, as realistic as possible. And how we're going to do that is, or at least how I'm going to attempt to do that, because this is the first time I've ever done one of these, try to bring in a little bit of the darker colors along the bottom where it's rounded off going away from you. And then we're going to highlight some of this area that's closest to us. We're going to just say that our light source is basically from straight out in front of the top here. We're not going to say anything specific in terms of maybe the sun is hitting it or what, but so with our smaller brush now, I'm just going to come in here and get in these tighter spaces. Some of this area up here around this stem that I couldn't really get into. And we're going to make this thing the brightest right along this area that's here in the front center, that would be essentially the closest part of the pumpkin to us viewing it from this direction. Now down here along the bottom, I'm going into a little bit more of the red. In our mix to darken that up a little bit as it's curving away from the viewer down here. Now in the upper areas here, I'm going to start introducing some yellows in there. Just because when you look at a pumpkin, you do get a little bit of a splotchy coloration. And so I'm going to put that in there kind of thin and then just smear it around with my brush. Fade it down into the bottom there. Again, this is just some medium yellow that I'm touching into that's fairly thin. And just putting it in there and pushing it around a little bit with the brush. I'm mostly putting the yellow in at a starting point that is in this area that's the closest to the viewer that I want to be the brightest. And then I'm working it away from that point and fading it. On these back here along these edges, I just want to brighten up the front edge of that part of the pumpkin. And that one might have been a little too much yellow, so I'm going to come back over and put our orange value back over that just a tad. There we go. Again, the good thing about painting is we can always fix it. I'm going to continue to brighten this one up right in front and center here because I want it to be a little more contrast. Same thing with this one next to it. Now that back one in the edge again, I just want to brighten up that front leading edge of it. And maybe fade our orange down into that red a little bit farther. All right, I think we're getting somewhere. We can put a few final highlight touches on this in a minute. I'm gonna let that dry for a few seconds and see how those values come out before I do any more. So let's give that a few minutes to dry and then we'll come back to it. Okay, now that that has had a few minutes to dry, I'm fairly pleased with how that looks. I think I'm going to fade a little bit of that yellow color up a little bit higher on a couple of spots, and then I will touch in a couple of brighter highlights with a little bit of titanium white coming into the mix. But other than that, I think we've arrived at a pretty good place with this. So I'm not going to do a lot more with the big one anyway. Then we'll move over to the smaller pumpkin and start doing that. So again, I'm just going to take this medium yellow value just a little bit higher. And then I think we'll add a couple of highlight areas with a little bit of titanium white and our orange mix right along a couple of edges maybe. Something like that, I think. Now I'd say we have the makings of a pretty good first pumpkin. So we're going to basically repeat that process over here on the little guy. We're going to use our smaller brush to come in with a little brighter orange value than what we've got up there. And I may have to go actually to an even smaller brush than this. In fact, I'm sure that I will, to finish detailing this one out, because some of those areas in tight around the stem and the edges of our contour lines on this pumpkin, I'm going to have to get a little bit smaller brush to fit in there. So for now, let's get our major coverage area with this brush that we've got, and then we'll come back with the other. Alright, I think that's got us, it's about as far as we can go with this brush, so let's downsize yet again to something a little smaller. Something that'll allow us to get into these slightly tighter spaces. I'm going to go back into a little bit of the red again to darken up the areas along the bottom of this pumpkin. I think I'll carry that color with the red in it in a couple of places up around this stem. And now we're going to repeat our process that we did here. We're going to come back in, brighten up this area in the middle that will be the closest to the viewer. Now we can start introducing our yellow again, so going back into some medium yellow. And I'm just kind of adjusting the areas here that have the darker grooves to them a little bit, filling them in some. I don't think I want them quite that distinct. On this smaller pumpkin, I want those lines to maybe be a little smaller. Maybe something to that effect. Now let's go back with our yellow. And last but not least, we're going to go back into our mix of titanium white with the orange to create our last little shine highlight. I think I might want to darken that up at the top a little bit. Maybe I carried that highlight a little too high on some of these. So let's correct that a little bit. I think I want to adjust this pumpkin a little bit more down here, not show quite so much of that darker groove. And then carry my yellow down a little bit further. Again, I'm just making some adjustments here that make me feel a little bit better about this particular pumpkin. If you're happy with what you got, stay with it. If you're not happy, when I stepped back and looked at that, I decided that I wanted to change it a little bit. Then you change it a little bit. So let's come back now in with our last bit of white and orange highlight again. Okay, now I'm pretty happy with that. So I think we are going to now move to our hay that is along the foreground in this square hay bale here on the left. And really all we're going to do for that is put in a lot of different directional brush strokes in a couple of different values of that kind of cream color, tan color. And hopefully when we put enough in there, it will look like a lot of hay stacked on top of one another. So we're going to go with, I think I'm just going to use this tiny little angle brush I've been using for the time being. We may have to switch over to a liner brush for the last little bit. But for now, let's go into some yellow ochre and some titanium white. And keep this paint fairly thin. See what kind of value we get there. That's not bad. And really, you're just going to want some brush strokes in all manner of directions. So and we will put a few up that come up on our pumpkin. I am making some of these brush strokes right along the bottom a little heavier and a little wider, just to give maybe the illusion that some of those are a little closer in. And then back here along that wall, I'm keeping those a little thinner. And now I think I have decided for that square bale there to the left that we are going to really have hay going in all manner of direction as well, but a lot of it is going to be more vertical. And we're just going to have to come in here with several different values of tan, cream color, maybe a little bit of yellow in here to really thicken this up. And give us the impression of a full, packed, thick, square bale of hay. So this is going to take a couple of passes. And I think I will switch now over to a liner brush to do the rest. Thin our paint down, use a liner brush. And start to change up our values of our colors to create a good variety in here. We'll extend a few of these up, but not a lot. And the first thing I'm going to do is darken my value here to come to this front corner. We'll go a little bit more yellow ochre and a little bit of raw umber to it. Start with a couple of darker there. Now we'll put some of this in here as well. We don't have to be as precise with this darker color because we're going to be covering a lot of that up. So I'm really just kind of globbing it in some places. And it's just a process that's going to take a few minutes, so really start to stack in a lot of color into this hay. We're going to introduce a little bit of medium yellow to this mix now. still on the darker side of things though. Again, just another variety of color to put in here. And by literally just kind of dabbing it in here with a liner brush, you get all kinds of little crisscross directions and random things. So that's why I'm using this liner brush. Okay, now we're going to keep playing around with our colors there. We're going to go into more yellow ochre, more titanium white. Alright, so I'm going to continue to work here on just laying in different values of these colors that I'm dealing with to create multiple layers of straw and hay in here, with the last thing we do being putting in the brightest values and highlights last over the top. I'm going to put a little bit more titanium white into my mix now. And again, I'm keeping this paint pretty thin. And just really getting random with these directions and these brush strokes and adding in these lighter colors. Just to create a really full looking bale of hay back here. And we'll add just a little bit more titanium white to the mix one more time to really create the last little bit of highlight. And I'm going to put a good bit more of this brighter highlight up here on the top of this bale. Since we're saying that our light source is just coming from somewhere straight out in front, I'm going to create the illusion that this is more of a square shaped bale by adding a little bit more of this highlight to the top. Alright, we're looking pretty good. I think I'm going to come in with some almost pure titanium white now to finish this off with just a couple of places of a really bright highlight. And I'm going to keep these near the front, down towards the bottom of the canvas. These are almost pure white. And then just a couple back here. Okay. Well, I'm pretty satisfied with this one. I don't really see much else to do, to be honest with you, other than stick a signature on this and call it done. So there is my first attempt now at some pumpkins sitting near a red barn on some hay. I'm pretty pleased with how this one turned out. Maybe if you guys painted along with that one, you've got something you're happy with as well. I'm going to say this one is finished. So we'll catch you guys next time. Thanks for watching.